Imagine waking up to the sound of fists banging on your door. It's not even dawn yet. You hear strange voices shouting outside, metal clanking, and the cocking of rifles. You barely have time to grab your boots before the door bursts open. Suddenly, armed men in badges rush in with their hard faces and intent. They shove you out of your home at gunpoint. Your heart begins to pound, and your breath gets short. Outside, the dirt roads of Bisbee, Arizona, are filled with terrified miners, black, Mexican, and white herded together like cattle. Hundreds of them. Some were still in their nightclothes, others barefoot. Armed vigilantes and company guards, who were deputized by the sheriff, shoved men into line. The air became thick, filled with dust and tension. You don't understand. You weren't even part of the strike. You showed up for work yesterday. You never raised a fist in protest. But none of that mattered. To them, you're just another troublemaker. When noon came, you and more than 1,000 others were bundled into cattle cars, sweat rolling down your skin under the scorching heat. The train accelerates forward, carrying you away from the only home you've ever known. No trial, no charges, no chance to fight back. You are no longer a miner. You are now a cargo. This is not a scene from a dystopian movie. This is the Bisbee Deportation of 1917. One of the most shocking and brutal labor crackdowns in American history. Over 1,200 miners were kidnapped, loaded onto railroad train cars, and dumped in the middle of the New Mexico desert with no food, no water, no supplies, and no means of getting home. Most history books call this a labor dispute, but for the black miners who were caught in the chaos, it was something far worse. It was a betrayal from the company they worked for, by the white unions that claimed solidarity, and by a system that never saw them as anything more than disposable labor. Bisbee wasn't just about copper, wages, or unions. It was about race. Black miners had already fought for decades just to survive in an industry that saw them as expendable. They had been lured to Arizona with promises of stable work, only to be used, abused, and finally discarded. This deportation was the final blow. Proof that, no matter how hard they worked, they would never truly belong. But how did it come to this? Why were even non-striking black miners bundled up and deported? How did the Phelps Dodge Corporation manipulate racial tensions to crush labor resistance? And why has this story, especially the betrayal of black miners, almost been completely erased from history? The Bisbee deportation was more than an illegal crackdown. It was a brutal example of how race and labor were deeply related in early 20th century America. It was a warning one that still echoes in today's labor struggles. This is the story of the forgotten black miners of Bisbee, the lies they were told, and the betrayal they never saw coming. By the early 20th century, Bisbee, Arizona, was one of the richest mining towns in the United States. It was often called the Queen of the Copper Camps because of its production rate of more than 8 billion pounds of copper over its lifetime. The copper industry was booming, especially during the World War I era. The demand for metal skyrocketed as nations prepared for war, and big corporations like Phelps Dodge, the most powerful mining company in the region, took full advantage of it and leveraged on the demand. Like many other mining towns, Bisbee was a company town. Everything revolved around the mines. The stores, housing, law enforcement, and even the local government were controlled by Phelps Dodge. The corporation dictated every aspect of life, like who got hired and who could live where. If you worked in Bisbee, you worked for Phelps Dodge, whether directly in the mines or in one of the town's supporting industries. Those who opposed the company's influence on the town often found themselves jobless or in worse scenarios. But while Bisbee was thriving economically, the men doing the backbreaking labor in its underground tunnels were barely able to afford the essentials. Mining was one of the most dangerous and grueling jobs in America at the time. Deep underground, miners worked in pitch-black tunnels, hacking at the rock with picks and drills as dust choked their lungs. Temperatures could reach 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and cave-ins, explosions, and poisonous gas leaks were common occurrences. Miners worked 10 to 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, and for this gruesome job, they earned only $3.50 per day, which was barely enough to survive. But the real suffering wasn't just the physical labor, it was the way the system was positioned against certain workers. While white workers were given slightly better jobs and had a chance to be promoted to higher offices, black and Mexican miners were permanently stuck at the bottom. They were given the most dangerous tasks, handling explosives, digging in unstable tunnels, and processing ore in toxic conditions. And when injuries occur, there was no compensation. If a white worker was injured, there was a slim chance the company might take care of them. But if a black miner lost a limb or got sick from mine dust, they were swiftly replaced. There was always another desperate man willing to take their place. For black miners, survival was a daily fight, not just against the mines, but against the system itself. Like many companies of the era, Phelps Dodge operated on a strict racial hierarchy. Workers were divided by ethnicity, and black miners were placed at the bottom of the social order. White workers were given the best-paying jobs, often as machine operators or supervisors. They had a stronger voice in unions and were more likely to receive company benefits. Some white workers saw black and Mexican miners as competitors, which made racial tensions even worse. On the other hand, Mexican workers made up the largest minority workforce in Bisbee. They were typically assigned to dangerous and low-paying underground jobs. They faced discrimination and racial violence, but some white unions were willing to work with them. Black workers faced the harshest discrimination. They were given the most hazardous jobs with the lowest pay. They had no union representation, as most white-led unions refused to fight for them. They were often exploited by both the mining company and the white unions, who saw them as disposable. Many black miners had come to Arizona from Texas, Louisiana, and other southern states in search of better opportunities. Some had fled Jim Crow laws and lynch mobs, believing that Arizona, a newer state, might offer a fresh start. Little did they know that they had jumped from the pan into the fire, one that was just as ruthless, but far more deceptive. At first, labor unions seemed like an icon of hope for workers who were struggling under Phelps Dodge's harsh conditions. The Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, also known as the Wobblies, rose as a powerful force in Bisbee, promising to fight for fair wages and safer working conditions, and to put an end to racial discrimination. But for black miners, this promise was an illusion, one that was never fulfilled. Many white union leaders refused to fully integrate black miners into their ranks. When strikes happened, black miners were often used as scapegoats, accused of being company men even when they suffered the same abuses as everyone else. The unions talked about worker solidarity, but when it came time to fight for better wages, black and Mexican workers were left behind. This put black miners in an impossible position. If they joined the strike, they risked retaliation from both the company and racist white workers who saw them as competitors. But if they stayed neutral or kept working, they were labeled as traitors to the labor movement. Either way, they lost. This division would soon come to a breaking point. Phelps Dodge knew exactly how to manipulate racial divisions to maintain control. They had no intention of ever treating workers fairly, but they used racial tensions to prevent true worker unity. They spread rumors that black miners were working with the company against white unions. As though that wasn't enough, they hired private spies to infiltrate union meetings and stir up racial resentment. They intimidated black miners, warning them that if the unions won, they would be the first to lose their jobs. And when tensions finally erupted in 1917, Phelps Dodge seized the opportunity to destroy the labor movement once and for all. They turned workers against each other, branded them as radicals and criminals, and then used their power to erase them from the town. By the summer of 1917, Bisbee was a powder keg waiting to explode. The IWW had called for a massive strike, demanding better pay and safer working conditions. Thousands of miners walked off the job. Phelps Dodge and its allies in the local government declared war on the unions. They mobilized a vigilante force of over 2,000 armed men, deputized civilians, local law enforcement, and hired guns, ready to crush the strikers by any means necessary. But when the crackdown began, it wasn't just the striking miners who were targeted. The company and its enforcers didn't just want to stop the union, they wanted to get rid of anyone they saw as a threat. That meant black miners too. Even those who hadn't participated in the strike found themselves rounded up, forced at gunpoint onto trains, and shipped out of town like cattle. It was the ultimate betrayal. The very workers who had been used to keep the mines running were now seen as expendable. What happened next would shock the nation, but not enough to bring justice to those who suffered. It was a calculated racial purge disguised as corporate security, And for the black miners who had already endured so much, it was the final, crushing proof that their lives had never truly mattered to those in power. By 1917, Bisbee, Arizona was a town on the edge of chaos. Phelps Dodge was making unprecedented profits. Yet, the men who risked their lives extracting copper from the depths of the earth saw little of that wealth. The industrial workers of the world, IWW, aka the Wobblies, had long been active in labor movements across the country. Unlike other unions, which often catered only to white workers, the IWW prided itself on its inclusive vision of worker solidarity. It organized across racial and ethnic lines, welcoming black, Mexican, and immigrant workers into its ranks, at least in theory. By the summer of 1917, tensions between Phelps Dodge and the IWW had reached a boiling point. When the company refused to negotiate over wages and working conditions, the union called for an all-out strike. The decision to strike had devastating consequences for black miners. For white miners, the decision to join the strike was relatively straightforward. They believed that if they stood together, they could force Phelps Dodge to improve wages and conditions. But for black miners, the choice was far more complicated and dangerous. While the IWW claimed to be racially inclusive, many black miners didn't trust white-led unions. Their skepticism wasn't unfounded. In the past, white workers had excluded black miners from better-paying jobs and union leadership roles. Even in strikes, some white union leaders refused to acknowledge that black workers faced additional racial discrimination from both the company and the unions themselves. In many scenarios, black workers were only welcomed into labor movements when they were needed for numbers, not because white workers saw them as equals. Black miners also knew that joining the strike could mean immediate retaliation. The company routinely fired black workers who got involved in labor disputes, knowing they had little legal backing. Unlike white workers, black miners were often denied housing and could be evicted from company-owned homes without warning. Phelps Dodge exploited racial divisions by labeling black miners as loyal workers when they refused to strike, only to turn against them later. Some white strikers saw black workers as strikebreakers, even when they were neutral. Others feared that Phelps Dodge would use black labor to replace striking white workers permanently. In the past, racial violence had erupted when white miners accused black workers of taking their jobs. On June 26, 1917, the IWW officially launched its strike. Thousands of miners walked off their jobs, demanding fair wages and safer working conditions. Bisbee became a town at war with itself. Strikers marched through the streets, waving banners that read, "Solidarity forever," and "An injury to one is an injury to all." Phelps Dodge shut down operations in retaliation, refusing to negotiate with the workers. Armed deputies and company guards patrolled the town in search of troublemakers. At first, the strike seemed to be working. More miners joined the movement each day. But as the days dragged on, Bisbee jumped into paranoia and chaos. Local newspapers demonized the IWW, calling them radicals and un-American. Business owners who depended on the mines turned against the strikers. The company spread rumors that IWW leaders were anarchists and socialists plotting to overthrow the government. Black miners found themselves fighting against this escalating conflict. While tensions in Bisbee got extreme, Phelps Dodge saw an opportunity. The company knew it couldn't afford to let the strike succeed. If the workers won, it would set a dangerous precedent. Miners across the country would demand better wages, safer conditions, and a say in how the industry operated. So rather than negotiating, Phelps Dodge did what it did best. It weaponized race. They spread false rumors that black workers were loyal to the company and were secretly working against the strike. They accused black miners of being company spies, even when they had no involvement. They framed the strike as a white man's fight, further isolating black and Mexican workers. White and black workers, who should have been fighting together, were now turning against each other. Even worse, many white strikers fell for Phelps Dodge's tactics. Instead of demanding better treatment for all workers, some focused their anger on black miners, accusing them of betrayal. This racial division played directly in the company's favor, and soon it gave them the excuse they needed to crush the strike completely. As tensions boiled over, Bisbee's business elite, law enforcement, and mining executives came together to plan their next move. They decided that the strike had to be destroyed by force. On July 11, 1917, a secret meeting was held between Sheriff Harry Wheeler, a staunch company ally, Phelps Dodge executives, local politicians and businessmen, pro-company miners, and anti-strike groups. Together they formed a 2,000-man vigilante force known as the Citizens Protective League. This wasn't an official police force, it was a mob, armed and deputized, with orders to round up and remove troublemakers from Bisbee. The next morning, at dawn, these men invaded the homes and boarding houses of miners, pulling them from their beds at gunpoint. This was one of the most extreme acts of corporate violence in U.S. history. But what many history books fail to mention is that black miners who had already been isolated by both the company and the unions were among the first to be targeted. They weren't just seen as strikebreakers, they were perceived as expendable. July 12, 1917. Bisbee, Arizona. The sun had barely started its ascent over the rugged landscape when the town's silence was suddenly shattered. Armed men, thousands of them, marched through the streets, some deputized by the sheriff, others just local business owners and anti-union miners. What was their mission? To rid Bisbee of anyone they deemed un-American. But let's be clear, this wasn't about patriotism. This was about power. And those in power had already decided who had to go. At exactly 5 a.m., the first wave of arrests began. Armed vigilantes stormed homes, mining camps and boarding houses, and dragged men from their beds at gunpoint. They weren't just arresting strikers, they were targeting them. Black miners were among the first to be seized. Whether they had joined the strike or not, it didn't matter. Some were yanked from their breakfast tables, barely given time to put on their shoes. Others were thrown into the streets, their belongings tossed after them like garbage. A few were confused and terrified. They tried to plead with their captors, but the men rounding them up weren't listening. One black miner, by the name Elijah Carter, had worked for Phelps Dodge for 8 years. He had a reputation as a hard-working man who never missed a shift. But that didn't matter on that fateful morning. As Carter stood on his porch, barefoot and trembling, a deputy grabbed him by the collar and slammed him into the dirt. The deputy said angrily, "We don't need your kind here anymore." What was his crime? Existing in the wrong place, at the wrong time. When the morning had almost faded away, over 1,300 men had been captured. They were marched in lines through the streets like prisoners of war, hands in the air, rifles pointed on their backs. And the people of Bisbee did nothing but watch. Some peered from windows, silent and afraid. Others, wives, children, business owners loyal to Phelps Dodge, stood along the sidewalks, jeering, mocking the men as they passed. Some of the black miners recognized faces in the crowd. They saw men who had once been their drinking buddies, women who had once shopped at their stores. But now they were strangers, outsiders, enemies, targets. They were herded like cattle to Warren baseball field, normally a place for friendly games and celebrations. Today it was a makeshift prison. Once inside, the men were lined up in rows, exhausted and confused. And then Sheriff Harry Wheeler stepped forward. Wheeler wasn't just a lawman, he was a businessman's enforcer, a company man through and through. With his hat tilted low over his eyes, he scanned the crowd before speaking. He said, "You're all traitors to this town. You're all done here. We're putting you on a train and you're never coming back." The crowd erupted in cheers. But what crime had they committed? No trial, no defense, no explanation, only guilt by association, and for the black miners, guilt by race. One by one, names were called and men singled out for special punishment. Mexican miners were beaten with butts of rifles and accused of being foreign agitators. White union organizers were spit on and some were branded as Bolsheviks or terrorists. And black miners? They were singled out as the biggest traitors of all. At noon, a line of boxcars rolled into town. This wasn't a passenger train. This was a cattle train. Men were shoved inside like livestock one by one, jammed together, shoulder to shoulder, with no water, no food, no escape, and not enough room for ventilation. By the time the doors slammed shut, the July heat was unbearable. For 16 solid hours, the train rattled across the desert, carrying over 1,300 men to an unknown destination. The air inside became thick with sweat and dust. Some men collapsed from heat exhaustion before they even reached their destination. Others tried to claw at the wooden slats for air, only to be met with rifle barrels from the guards standing on the train's rooftop. When the train finally screeched to a halt, the men were dumped in the middle of the New Mexico desert. No food, no shelter, just hundreds of exhausted, betrayed workers left to die under the merciless sun. Back in Bisbee, the town celebrated and rejoiced over their departure. Phelps Dodge hailed the operation as a success, claiming they had removed undesirable elements from their workforce. The local newspaper printed headlines like, "Bisbee cleans house, the strike is over. Good riddance to the IWW menace." And the black miners, they weren't even mentioned. They had been erased, used, thrown away, and forgotten. When news of the deportation reached the federal government, President Woodrow Wilson's administration called for an investigation. But no one was ever arrested in the case. No one was ever held accountable. No one ever paid for the crimes that were committed that day. The Bisbee Deportation of 1917 was one of the most blatant acts of corporate and racial violence in American history. And yay, it's barely taught in schools. It's a story of power, betrayal, and racism. A moment in history when black miners were abandoned by both the unions that claimed to fight for them and the companies that had used them. It's a reminder that black workers have always been on the front lines of labor struggles. And more often than not, they've been the first to be sacrificed. However, Bisbee is just one example. Across America, black workers have fought and are still fighting for justice, only to face betrayal from all sides. So the question is, how many more stories like this have been buried? And what else is still hidden in the shadows of history? The Bisbee Deportation of 1917 was over. The deed has been done. The boxcars had vanished down the tracks, disappearing into the heat-hazed horizon, carrying over 1,200 broken men into exile. Back in Bisbee, the sun rose on a town that had purged itself of so-called troublemakers. There were no bodies in the streets, no smoking buildings, no visible scars of war. But make no mistake, a war had been fought. And for the black miner, this was a war they never stood a chance of winning. By the morning after the deportation, Bisbee was already moving on. In the eyes of Phelps Dodge, the mining company that orchestrated the entire operation, this was a victory. A brutal, bloody, and illegal victory, but a victory nonetheless. Newspapers hailed Sheriff Harry Wheeler as a hero, praising his swift action in defending Bisbee from radical agitators. Business owners were happy about the town's cleansing, confident that production would continue without disruption. The remaining miners, those who had stayed silent, those who had sided with the company, went back to work. The message was clear: Phelps Dodge was in control. And as for those who had been forced onto the train, they were erased from the town's memory. 200 miles away, in the middle of the desert, the men who had been deported were struggling to survive. Many of them had nothing but the clothes on their body. They were dumped like cattle in the scorching New Mexico wilderness. No food, no water, no shelter, and no way home. They were stuck and stranded in the middle of nowhere, a place far from home. Some collapsed from heat exhaustion. Their bodies were too weak to keep moving. Others wandered aimlessly, desperate to find a town, a ranch, anything that could be of relief. But who would help them? Most towns were controlled by the same corporate interests that had orchestrated the deportation in the first place. And for the black miners, the situation was even worse. They were now stranded in an unfamiliar, hostile land where Jim Crow laws dictated their every move. They were now seen as outsiders in Bisbee. Where could they go? Who would take them in? And perhaps the most painful question of all, why had this happened to them in the first place? Back in Washington, word of the Bisbee deportation spread rapidly. The sight of over 1,200 men being marched at gunpoint, compressed into boxcars and dumped in the desert was impossible to ignore. The country was in the middle of World War I, and suddenly, headlines about Bisbee painted an ugly picture. Newspapers called it a lawless act of vigilante justice. Union leaders demanded action. President Woodrow Wilson himself ordered a federal investigation. For a moment, just a brief moment, it seemed like Bisbee's elite might face the consequences of their actions. But then, the cover-up began. A team of federal investigators arrived in Bisbee. They interviewed witnesses, they collected statements, and what they found was hard to believe. The deportation had been completely illegal, unconstitutional, and a blatant violation of human rights. Federal prosecutors even prepared charges against some of the key personalities involved, including Sheriff Harry Wheeler. But just when it seemed like justice was within reach, everything stalled. Arizona's courts refused to prosecute the case. Local judges who were loyal to Phelps Dodge and its allies dismissed the charges quickly. The deportation was rebranded as a necessary act of self-defense against communists and anarchists. What happened to Sheriff Wheeler, the man who had led the arrests? He was never punished. Instead, he ran for office again shockingly. He won again. Phelps Dodge? The company faced no consequences, no fines, no lawsuits, no public apologies. In the end, not a single person was held accountable for what happened in Bisbee. For the black miners, the aftermath was even more devastating. Most of them never returned to Bisbee. Some attempted to go back to mining in other towns, but their names were blacklisted. The word had spread. These men were seen as troublemakers. No one wanted to hire them. No one wanted to help them. And that was how many faded into history. Their stories remain untold. Their lives forever altered by a crime that no one wanted to remember. The unions that had claimed to fight for workers' rights had also been abandoned. White union leaders were too busy defending themselves to speak up for the black workers who had suffered alongside them. And Bisbee? Bisbee went back to business as usual. The mining continued. The town thrived in the wealth of Phelps Dodge. And the Bisbee deportation became just another footnote in history. But the story of Bisbee didn't end in 1917. Its legacy lives on. Because what happened in Bisbee wasn't just about one town. It was about power. It was about who gets to decide who belongs and who gets erased. And it was also about race. For black workers in America, the Bisbee deportation was just one chapter in a long, painful history of betrayal. It was a warning that even when they worked hard, even when they followed the rules, even when they gave their sweat and blood to build this country, they were still expendable. And that is a lesson America still hasn't fully learned. But history doesn't disappear just because those in power want it to. And justice, even when denied, can still be pursued. The question is, how many more Bisbees have been buried? How many more betrayals have been erased? And how much longer will we allow history to repeat itself? The story of the Bisbee deportation is more than just an isolated incident in an Arizona mining town. It's a piece of a much larger puzzle. A story that stretches back centuries and continues even today. Because what happened in Bisbee wasn't just about a labor strike. It wasn't just about corporate greed. It was about power. It was about who has it, who doesn't, and how those at the top will do whatever it takes to keep it. For black miners, the betrayal they suffered was not strange. It was a familiar pattern. A pattern that has played out across American history, on plantations, in factories, on railroads, in steel mills, and in other industries. A pattern where black labor was welcomed when it was needed, but discarded, demonized, and destroyed the moment it became inconvenient. And the Bisbee deportation. It was just another chapter in this long, bloody history. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the American labor movement was growing. Workers, especially in dangerous industries like mining, steel, and railroads, were beginning to fight back against wealthy industrialists who saw them as nothing more than disposable tools. But there was a problem that those in power exploit at every turn. And that problem was race. While workers of all races suffered under brutal conditions, the labor movement itself was deeply divided along racial lines. Many unions refused to allow black workers to join. White laborers often saw black workers as threats, not allies. Instead of uniting against the bosses, white workers often sided with them, especially when it meant keeping black workers in a second-class position. And who benefited from this division? The same corporations that exploited them both. Mining companies like Phelps Dodge understood this all too well. They knew that if black and white workers ever stood together, their power would be unstoppable. So they set up flames of division, using racism as a tool to keep workers weak, fractured, and vulnerable to control. And in Bisbee, that strategy worked perfectly. For black miners, the labor struggle was a double-edged sword. They were brought into industries like mining, steel, and railroads, not out of goodwill, but out of corporate necessity. Whenever white workers went on strike, companies hired black workers to replace them. Not because they valued black labor, but because they knew it would break the power of the strike. This was nothing but a cruel trap. If black workers refused the jobs, they remained unemployed and wallowed in poverty. But if they took the jobs, they were seen as strikebreakers, fueling racial resentment from white workers. And when the companies no longer needed them, like in Bisbee, they were discarded without a second thought, with no protection, no support, and no justice. Just like in sharecropping, just like in convict leasing, just like in every other labor system black workers had been forced into, the moment they became a threat to the status quo, they were punished. This incident wasn't an accidental occurrence, but a strategy. It was a calculated, deliberate strategy used by powerful corporations to keep workers, black, white, immigrant, native-born, fighting each other instead of fighting the true enemy. Think about this for a moment. In the South, white landowners kept black and poor white sharecroppers divided to ensure both remained trapped in economic servitude. In the North, factory owners used waves of European immigrants to weaken organized labor movements, exploiting ethnic tensions just as they did racial ones. In the West, mining companies played Mexicans, Asians, and black workers against each other, offering scraps to one group while punishing the other, then switching tactics when convenient. The formula was always the same. Keep the workers divided and power stays in the hands of the few. And it worked for generations. The Bisbee Deportation was not the first time workers were betrayed. And if we remain silent, it won't be the last. Decades later, during the Civil Rights Movement, black workers continued to be exploited, often finding themselves locked out of unions, job opportunities, and fair wages. Even today, the same struggles can still be seen. Low wages, dangerous working conditions, and lack of job security. And most importantly, the continued use of race to divide and weaken the working class. Companies still use race to divide workers. They still pit struggling communities against each other. They still manipulate economic desperation to maintain control. Bisbee wasn't just history. It was a blueprint of what has happened, what is happening, and what is most likely going to continue if nothing is done about it. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Because history like this needs to be remembered, and conversations like this need to continue. Drop a comment below. What lessons do you take from Bisbee?